All right, good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for tuning in. I'm Richard Fontaine, CEO of the Center for a New American Security. We're really pleased this morning to be joined by Congressman Adam Smith, Chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, for this virtual fireside chat. Congressman, thank you very much for joining us today.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.
We're really looking forward to this conversation, and in a moment we'll get started with the discussion. Before we do, let me just run very quickly through a couple of administrative notes. The conversation will be is public. It'll be live streamed and recorded, and we'll post the video after the conclusion of the event. We'll reserve about 20 minutes or so at the end of the session to take questions from the Zoom audience. So those of you in the audience, be thinking about what you'd like to ask the Congressman. To submit the questions, you can use the Q&A function in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. And if you'd like your question to be asked, please identify yourself in order to get an answer to that. So with that, let's kick it off. Thank you again, Congressman, for joining us today. And maybe we can start with the NDAA. We're in the final stages of negotiating the NDAA, and sort of what are the big issues that are left to be resolved? What are the sticking points, and how are you seeing this year's legislation shaping up?
Well, I mean, the good news is I think we're a lot closer than we were last year. I mean, that always happens, when whether it's the House, the Senate, the White House, when any one of those flips parties in the first year after that, you're kind of feeling each other out for what's possible. The new majority, if it's in the House or the Senate or the new president, they have plans, and they try to figure out how you can negotiate them with the other two parts of the process. So, last year had a lot of issues. This year, it's a little bit narrower. We do have some things that there is some differences of opinion on, some things that were in the House bill that are more problematic. But the issues, I think, are narrower. Now, a lot of the issues, and this is, last year when we were talking about some of the bigger, more controversial issues that were more on the Democratic side, the issues that we wanted to push that the Republicans were going to be resistant to, there was a focus a lot on the partisan issues. But the truth is, I mean, there's a lot of issues in the NDAA that are not partisan, that are simply, what's the right policy here? And there's bipartisan groups on both sides, and we have to negotiate through those to get to a resolution as to what the right thing to do is. And that takes time. So, and we have, fewer of all of those, and I think we can get there. Now, there is one problem. Ever since, the start of September, I have been arguing to get the big four together to meet, because as you know, the way the process works, a lot of the negotiations happens on the staff level. I know there's a lot of people on this call who have been part of that staff level discussion, so they know how much work they do. And then there's a big part of it that's the chair and ranking from the House and the Senate. And I've been trying to get us to meet, for a long time, and we've met once for an hour. The Senate position basically is, we'll know more after the election, and I'm sure that is true. Hell, we'll know more after January 1st. But at some point you got to negotiate the issues. Now, some of the issues, are going to be issues that neither side's going to want to, make a decision on until after we know the election. But a lot of them aren't. A lot of them are things we could sit down and talk about. But, right now, the Senate is unwilling to meet until November 9th. So I'm deeply concerned at this point that November 9th is going to make it very difficult to get this done in the time that we need to get it done in. So the process is the problem. I mean, the issues I think we could hammer through, but you got to start hammering if you're going to get there.
Right. One issue that wouldn't seem to be a partisan one in general is just general oversight over use of force decisions made by the executive branch. And, at CNAS, we've done some work recently on congressional war powers, and both the legislative ones, but also the informal ways in which Congress influences those decisions all across the spectrum of activities. What is your kind of take on the current state of congressional oversight over the use of force? What's happening in Afghanistan and Syria and Iraq and other places where we've got active operations around the world?
Well, I mean, first of all, Republicans do tend to want to defer to the executive more than Democrats. So there was a little bit of a partisan tilt, and that's, regardless of, who the president is. Now, if the president is a Republican, that is particularly true. And that's what we encountered last year when we had a number of proposals to try to, reassert more congressional authority over this, repealing the 2002 AUMF, modifications to the 2001 AUMF. Some of those proposals didn't even make it in on the House side. And then, of course, language on Iran. So we were much more aggressive about it, and with a couple of exceptions. I mean, Matt Gaetz is very open to this conversation, but that's like one. So House, Senate got a little bit more difficult. So there is a little bit of a DR dynamic going on there, and then historically, it's really very difficult. The way the Constitution was set up, as you all know, I mean, the president's the commander in chief, but Congress has the right to declare war. Only problem is that's not defined anywhere. What does it mean? Nobody knows. The founding fathers gave us no real hint on what that meant. And the commander in chief, well, he controls the military. That's very clear. If the commander in chief wants to say, I'm going to send 100,000 troops to whatever country you want to, he gives the order, makes the decision, and goes forward. So as a practical matter, the history of our country, Democrat, Republican, whoever the president is, the president has an enormous amount of authority to commit troops to battle, and Congress has struggled for over 200 years to figure out how to rein that in. Frankly, I think if we want to reduce military activity by the president, public pressure tends to be the best way to do that, to make the president know that, that this is not what the people he represents want, and to push back in that way. In terms of getting the language in, the history of the War Powers Resolution. And the best example of this, and I've cited this before, was one of the best questions I've ever heard asked in the Armed Services Committee was around the time of Libya. Because the way the War Powers Act is supposed to work, the president sends up his notification, I'm doing this, and he has 60 days to do it. And at the end of 60 days, either hostilities must cease or Congress must approve of the action. Well, we hit the 60-day mark and things were not quite done in Libya. So the administration said that hostilities had ceased. And then Congressman Klein, retired now from Minnesota, asked a Obama official during one of our hearings, said, look, if someone lobbed 150 cruise missiles into Manhattan, would you consider that a hostile act? And he knew where this was going. So they could, we were still bombing Libya at the time that we had said hostilities had ceased. Well, why did President Obama say hostilities had ceased? Because it was necessary to wiggle his way around the War Powers Act. And that is but one of many examples. And that's sort of what I've wrestled with as we've tried to, insist upon tougher languages. Is that language going to yield anything? I mean, even the language we had last year had a self-defense exception. The Ro Khanna language on, you can't go into Iran without, meeting these certain criteria unless, well, what's self-defense? Okay. It's in the eye of the beholder, just apparently like hostilities are. So I want everyone, I say all of this because I want you to be mindful that if you're someone who thinks that the president has way too much power to commit troops and I'm one of those people, understand there is no one magic piece of legislation that's going to change that reality. It is a more complicated task than that.
I think that's absolutely right. With respect to Afghanistan in particular, what's your view on, well, I guess I'm not completely clear on what the plan is as we sit here today, but there's a withdrawal plan of sorts and a timeline of sorts, although administration officials have been in different places as how they've articulated if this is conditions-based, a timeline, et cetera. But what's your view about what we should be doing with our troops in Afghanistan, given the peace agreement, the troop withdrawals that the president seeks, the timeline that at least he's announced, seemingly announced to withdraw troops and so forth?
Yeah, I mean, there's two things about that. First of all, the president has been very aggressive about drawing down in Afghanistan. And I don't necessarily disagree with that. We have had an extended obligation in that part of the world. And at what point do we say, there's really not much more we can do here. And I'm not saying that everything's fine, we can pull out and there won't be any problems. What's the cost? What's the cost benefit to having that many US troops in Afghanistan, and the way the rest of the world will look at it, as, an occupying force. Even as the numbers come down, we have, I think it's over 4,000 troops now in Afghanistan. We've had more than that. There's a cost to that, both in terms of the risk to US service members, a cost in terms of the money, and also a cost in terms of how the rest of the world looks at us sort of imposing our will on others in a way that makes them uncomfortable. So I think the idea of bringing those numbers down, as the president has done, makes a lot of sense. Now, there's been sort of a plan to do that, and there's been sort of the tweet, in the tweet, we should get out by Christmas. Well, there's no plan to get out by Christmas. There's not. The White House hasn't submitted one. The Pentagon doesn't have one. So I think what you're going to see is you're going to continue to see a drawdown. Now, I think the whole conditions-based thing is a bit of a dodge, because if you're waiting until there's peace in Afghanistan, if those are the conditions you're waiting for, well, that's not going to happen. I think part of the conditions, though, are doing it safely. Okay, not placing our troops at risk, not running the risk of, leaving behind equipment that could fall into the wrong hands. How do you safely draw down so that you minimize the risk to our service members and you minimize the risk of weapons falling into enemy hands? But overall, I think continuing on an aggressive drawdown plan is probably in our best interests, even admitting the difficulties that are in that region. We've been there almost 20 years now. I think it's pretty clear that our military is not going to solve that problem.
Well, the counter argument to leaving is that, we risked then a terrorist sanctuary in Afghanistan along the lines of what we went in to fight all those years ago. Do you worry about the risks associated with a complete withdrawal from Afghanistan, or you think that can be mitigated adequately through various measures?
Well, I think there's unquestionably risks, and I think we need to have a better discussion. And this is part of what I'm hoping we can get to if we have a Biden administration, of, what are the risks? How are we trying to manage them? And I think that the risk that really makes sense to everybody that we need to be concerned about is the idea of a terrorist safe haven from which they can plan transnational attacks, which is certainly what Al-Qaeda did in Afghanistan. It's what they were able to do to some degree in Yemen. So we want to prevent that. Well, I'm pretty confident that we can get to the place where we can, working with partners in the region, using intel and other, we can contain that threat of that transnational attack without having that many boots on the ground, or necessarily any boots on the ground in Afghanistan. But what about the risk to regional instability? Is that, and how does our presence help or hurt that? So I think the idea that as long as we're there, everything is going to be fine, I think there are risks associated with that. So I think there are better ways to contain that threat that you're talking about than saying we're going to have a permanent military presence in Afghanistan.
You mentioned the possibility of a Biden administration. I guess everyone on this call is dimly aware that we have a national election next week. If there is a President Biden, we'll undoubtedly have a new national defense strategy. Where do you come down on the current NDS in terms of the way it's sort of framed the challenges, the prioritization of great power competition, de-emphasizing operations in some of the other regions, sort of steady state CT operations in the Middle East? Do you think that kind of general framework is something that should be built on, or that's flawed or good, or where do you sort of come down on that?
Well, the part of the framework that I'm most concerned about is the degree to which it appears that they want to start, sort of two separate Cold Wars with Russia and with China. And the idea that what great power competition means is that we have to build a military that can dominate both China and Russia in a direct confrontation. I do not support that. I think that is an extraordinarily dangerous approach. It's unbelievably expensive. First of all, I don't think it's achievable. I mean, the size of China, the size of Russia, the assets, and they're different. Russia's assets are really more, a history of a strong military and building that back up. China is sheer economic power, and what that can lead to in terms of their ability to build military and defense capabilities. The idea that we're going to somehow, there's enough money in the world for us to build a military that can guarantee victory over both Russia and China, I don't think the facts bear that out. So it's a fool's errand to try to go down there thinking, and this is the whole thing behind the 500 ship Navy, which drives me insane, by the way. I was not a fan of the 355 ship Navy because what does that even mean? What we need to focus on is capabilities. What are we trying to accomplish? It's like they pulled 500. Well, we want to look like we're tough. Well, what looks tough? Well, 500 is more than 355. So by definition, that's tougher, right? Now, okay, capability is what matters. What are you trying to accomplish? We seem to be obsessed with the notion that whatever Russia and China are building, we have to build 10 more. We need to have a smarter strategy about what great power competition in this context means. And I think what it means is, how do we deter our adversaries from doing the things that most threaten us? And in a lot of cases, that doesn't have much to do with our military might. It has to do with alliances, partnerships across the world. It has to do with diplomacy, development, building relationships. So I am worried that the national defense strategy is really a recipe for a very dangerous and unnecessary Cold War. And I think that there is a substantial reason to re-examine that and rethink about how we want to approach it.
I'm going to come back in a second to what you've described as a rational, democratic, progressive national security strategy. But let me ask you about alliances quickly. And in the context of the congressional oversight matter that you were talking about a minute ago on use of force, you talked about some of the constitutional and other issues with congressional oversight or restraining presidential use of force and so on. How does that sort of work when you're talking about allies? I'm thinking of the recent action to halt the removal of U.S. forces from Germany, or these efforts to say, well, if the president wanted to withdraw from NATO, that Congress would have a say before he was sort of able to do that, and things like that. I mean, are those, in reality, in practice, are those real sort of barriers to the president exercising his will on alliance matters?
Well, we are in unfortunate and what I hope are unique circumstances in that, I've read an article several years ago now, because there's sort of an initial impression when you look at President Trump's foreign policy to sort of, and I love the quote from Jared Kushner on this one. I'm not a big Alice in Wonderland fan. As many of you know, I like movie and book references and everything, but I read Alice in Wonderland when I was a kid, but it didn't really stick. But apparently there's a line in there about how when you don't know where you're going, you're never on the wrong path. And that's what Kushner said about the president. And for most of us observing this objectively, yeah, that sounds about right. Yeah, whatever the idea of the day is, whatever pops into my head in front of an audience or when I'm sitting there getting ready to tweet, well, that's what we'll do today. But there's actually more of a plan on foreign policy to what he's been doing, and not in a good way. And there are basically three components to it. One, he is distrustful of alliances and partnerships, because he basically thinks that we've been suckers in those all this years. Now, keep in mind, this is a guy who thinks a good business deal is where, you get someone to give you a lot of money and then you figure out how not to pay it back. Sort of the wimpy approach. I'll gladly pay you Tuesday for a hamburger today, which I guess is good economics until they send you to jail for doing it. So you've got to build a partnership. But his impression on all of this is, we've been helping out all these other countries in the world. We don't get anything for it. Well, what we get for it is global stability. And what we get for it is the most prosperous country in the history of the world because of that global stability. There's a benefit there. The president's orientation from the very start has been, let's get out of this stuff. I don't want to hold up my end of the bargain. And so Congress has had to insert itself in a somewhat unprecedented way, to say, no, we shouldn't pull out of NATO. No, we shouldn't pull all of our troops out of South Korea. There is a reason for that relationship. So we've had to do more of that than at any time, certainly in my time in Congress. And I don't know about the historical precedents here. So, and how binding is that? let's say that we had passed something that said you must have congressional approval before you pull out of NATO, and then the president woke up and said, we're pulling out of NATO. How does that fight play out? I don't really know, because we haven't had a history of that. But I do know that we should maintain those alliances. So that's one. Two has been the president wants to withdraw our presence from the world for much of the same reasons. He thinks we're not getting much out of it. So he wants the US to be less involved in global affairs. And lastly, he prefers dictators. He likes authoritarian strongman governments, and that's who he wants to have relationships with, whether it's Putin most famously, but Erdogan, Duterte, MBS. He has an affinity for dictators. All of those things, I think, need to be reversed. I think we need to have a positive presence in the world. The US is still an important major player that can make the world a better place. I think it's to our benefit to do that. I think alliances and partnerships are critical. And yes, occasionally we will have to work with people who don't live up to our democratic ideals, even understanding that we don't always live up to our democratic ideals. But the idea that economic and political freedom are positive things is something I think we do still need to advocate, and not just throw it overboard and say, you know what, I prefer a strong man government. So all of those things I think need to be reversed. But as far as the legislative executive branch battle here, never before in our history that I can remember has that battle really existed to this degree, and I'm hoping that will change soon.
On the political dimension of this alliance question that you talked about, I mean, it's clear that at least among some voters, this idea that America has gotten screwed by allies and sort of resonates. It's not clear to me anybody votes on this, but it resonates with your own constituents. Do you find it a hard thing to convince them that, for example, if Russia attacks Montenegro, the United States should defend Montenegro against Russian attack, or if China were to move on the Senkakus or the Philippines, given our mutual defense treaties, then we should use our military to defend them against China? I mean, that this generates these kind of sort of invisible benefits, which is hard, I think, to see on a daily basis, because you can't see the absence of our alliance structure to sort of test it against. But have you noticed that that's a hard sell among your constituents, or do people kind of get this?
And not without reason, by the way. I think my constituents, I think people in this country are, and this is part of what President Trump was able to play to back in 2016, what was a feeling that we were overextended. And don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that we got to be everywhere, do everything. No, I think in many cases, we did get overextended in some instances. That sort of the neocon outlook of the 90s, that the key to 21st century foreign policy was going to be US dominance. I think that was idiotic. It just, it didn't fit the way the world was going to go. And I think a lot of people on the right and the left looked at that and said, you're committing us to, to a level of, conflict, first of all, but just, a level of obligation that is not in our best interests. So being everywhere, doing everything, trying to dominate the world, I think is a real problem. And I completely agree with my constituents that we need to rethink that. I mean, the Iraq War is the great example that, I think there is a broad consensus now was a huge mistake, and that mistake was driven by that hubris, by that idea that, just like in the first Gulf War, well, we'll just assemble a bunch of things, we'll show up, we'll fix everything in 125 days and come home. And I think the idea that we should pull back from that approach, I completely agree with. But what does that problem have to do with pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal, or pulling out of the Paris Accords, or pulling out of, NATO is a little bit more difficult because it's a military alliance, and then you're committed to military action as a result. But the other piece of this is understand the value of deterrence. All right. If we did not have the presence that we have in Asia, primarily in South Korea, but also with Japan, it's a pretty fair bet that North Korea would have attacked South Korea a long time ago. And then what? Okay, when does that spread and become a problem? Now, you can always learn the wrong lesson here. All right. And, for post-World War II world was, We didn't think we had to worry about Hitler, and look what happened. We didn't think we had to worry about Hirohito, and look what happened. Well, you can also go too far in the other direction, like going into Vietnam, like going into Iraq. It's a balance. And I think both right and left constituents have every right to say, don't just go everywhere and try to do everything. What's the right balance? That's where I think our foreign policy discussion needs to go.
Well, that's a great predicate to talk about what you've articulated as a rational, democratic, progressive national security strategy. And I'd be interested to hear what that looks like, and also with the big question of the budget and where the defense budget goes under, if there is a Democratic president, maybe a Democratic Senate, and a Democratic House, how that fits into your vision for that strategy.
Well, there's an easy part and there's a hard part. The easy part, which you will hear on the campaign trail from every Democrat, myself included, is, we need more alliances, more partnerships, more international agreements. We need to work with the world, not against the world, bring them together, form these partnerships to deal with our mutual security needs, including, by the way, climate change, pandemics. How can we work together globally to confront these threats that threaten us all, that are not unique to the United States or Russia or Iran or whoever? How can we work together on those broader problems? Then also diplomacy is incredibly important. Development is important. And you're going to see a lot of emphasis that. And I call that the easy part, because that's sort of I won't characterize it, but let's just say that, that's something that I think there's widespread agreement across the Democratic Party, and even broadly into many pieces of the Republican Party on that. Now, the tougher part, I guess I'm thinking of two areas in this. One, how much do you spend on defense? Two, what does your presence in the world look like? And that's where the Democratic Party is going to have some hard conversations. There is a growing wing, the progressive wing of our party, that wants to see the defense budget cut on general principle, basically. They think that spending money on, bombs and weapons of war is nowhere near as important as spending money on, well, just about anything else for that matter. So they want to reshift those priorities. But then connected to that is the second issue, which is, should we be, having drones fly over Somalia, taking out guys who we consider to be terrorists? Should we be doing it in Libya? Should we be doing it in Yemen? Should we have the troops we have in Afghanistan, for that matter? Is it our job to have a whole bunch of troops in Asia to make it less likely that China invades Taiwan? Is that a role that we have? So you're going to see those two big questions. What should the budget be? And what should our presence be out there in the world? Are going to be things that there's going to be, I think, a fair amount of clashes on within the Democratic Party.
And you've also been pretty outspoken about the costs associated with nuclear modernization over the years as one area where maybe there's some potential for cuts or reductions. I'd be interested in your sort of latest views on what you think should obtain in that area. And then also just the kind of threshold question of, do you think we still need a nuclear triad going forward?
Well, I think that the easiest way to sum this up is, I view our nuclear weapons as a deterrent to make sure that nuclear war never happens. I work with a lot of groups on this who are sympathetic to my approach. But they promote a world without nuclear weapons. They're trying to get to zero nuclear weapons. I don't support that. I mean, I suppose someone at some point could come up with an argument that convinces me that we can, in fact, get rid of them. But, to be cliche, you can't unring the bell. The technology exists, someone can build one. So what I want us to have is a nuclear arsenal that is sufficient to deter anyone from thinking that it makes sense to start a nuclear war, because we can make it clear that the cost will be too high for them to do that. We have a nuclear arsenal that still envisions, quote, winning a nuclear war. All right. That's what I find insane. And I always use the example of China. And I know there are plenty of people on this call who probably say, well, China's, they're expanding their nuclear arsenal and they're doing all, Last I checked, which was a couple of weeks ago, China had roughly 200 nuclear weapons. Okay. So let's say they double it. But they're still not going to be anywhere near the 4,000 that we have. China's philosophy has been very simple. We're going to build a reliable nuclear arsenal that is sufficient to inflict so much pain on any adversary that they will not dare pose an existential threat to us. Now, I think that's a pretty sound approach. It's also a heck lot cheaper than imagining that you have to build enough nuclear weapons to win a nuclear conflict. So I think and I'm confident that the Biden administration is, if it comes, is going to feel this way, that we need to re-examine the nuclear posture review. And this is the point at which all of my Republicans point out that the nuclear posture review came out of the Obama administration. I am abundantly aware of that. But as any good Republican would admit, the Obama administration was capable of being wrong. So we're going to sort of re-examine that issue. And I don't know where we're going to come out, but I'm quite confident that you're going to have a new look at the nuclear posture review. As far as the triad is concerned, again, I'm within deterrence. If a triad is necessary for that deterrence, I can see that argument. I'm skeptical about it. I frankly think that our ICBM fleet right now is driven as much by politics as it is by a policy necessity. There are certain states in the union that apparently are fond of being a nuclear target. And, it's part of their economy. It's what they do. Is it, I don't know. I have not decided. I have not definitively said, we don't need a triad anymore. Nor am I in the camp that we absolutely have to have one and it's not even worth talking about. It's worth talking about. It's worth having the debate to envision what should our nuclear deterrence policy look like and what do we need to build to achieve it.
Switch gears actually quite a bit. So I was in downtown DC yesterday, as at least a few people on this call probably were, and numerous buildings are boarding up their first floor plate glass windows with plywood, I guess, girding for possible election related violence or protests. It's a pretty daunting thing to see in our nation's capital. Do you think the military has any role to play at all in election security and managing any post-election violence, anything like that?
Yeah. Not at this point. Now, I mean, look, there's basic steps here. Basic step number one is the U.S. military is not engaged in domestic law enforcement. That is a core principle of our country, and it should be maintained. Now, that said, we've seen the National Guard called up to deal with the pandemic, deal with a bunch of different things. Not so much to enforce the laws, but to help those who are enforcing the laws. Is there a possible role for the Guard in that? There's been a role before. But by and large, my answer would be no. The U.S. military is not supposed to engage in domestic law enforcement. I was very pleased that Secretary Esper made that clear on the Insurrection Act issue over the summer, and I think that needs to continue to be our principle.
And would you have the same answer on response to protests against racial injustice?
Yeah, I mean, exactly. I mean, the source of the civil unrest is not the point.
Right. Got it.
The question is, what's the role the military should play in dealing with civil unrest? And I think as a general principle, it should be up to local law enforcement. Do you reach a point where maybe you start having a conversation about as I said, the Guard has helped out in the past, and maybe it can help out in the future. But the U.S. military should not be engaged in domestic law enforcement.
Let me ask you one more question, and then I'll start pulling in some of the audience questions. So for those who have questions but haven't yet put them in the Q&A box, please put them in the Q&A box, and I'll pull them out. I'm curious how you see the challenges to the department on issues of diversity and inclusion. So you've got the symbolic stuff, renaming bases that are named after Confederate soldiers and generals or not. And then you got the substantive part of this, the diversity of the officer corps or lack thereof and so forth. So I guess the first question is sort of, where do you think they are on that process of addressing those issues, and where do you think they need to head on those kinds of things?
First of all, I want to make clear, I don't agree that renaming the bases is symbolic, and I'll get into that in a minute. I think it is really, really substantive. Second, I think we've got a long way to go. The depth of the impact of systemic racism in our country, certainly the past history of systemic racism, but then even the continuing bigotry that we see in way too many places, I think is far greater than people realize. And I think society writ large, we got a lot of work to do. But just talking about the military, I think the same applies. And that's why, led by Anthony Brown on our committee this year, we have a number of provisions to try to aggressively promote diversity. Inspector General to make sure that hiring and promotions are being done in a fair manner. Looking at the UCMJ to make sure that it is being fairly applied. And you can see the lack of diversity in leadership across the military and understand the challenge that we have. I think we really need to come to terms with that history of racism and bigotry and what it means, which brings me back to our military bases. And those military bases were named what they were named to promote white supremacy, period, full stop. They were not named, oh, well, whatever the war was about, I think we can all agree that Robert E. Lee was a pretty good general. So let's go ahead and name it after him. Yeah. These bases were renamed, the statues were erected, and all of this stuff was done really at the turn of the 20th century. And go back and read some of the press accounts of those events when they erected these statues and the speeches that were given. They were, we must reaffirm white supremacy. That was the whole point of it. So there's nothing symbolic about it. It is an effort to have a certain noxious ideology promoted in this country. And if we don't remove that stain, then it's a big problem that is not just symbolic, but it's part of a fight that's been going on and continues to go on in this country. You saw it in Charlottesville, you've seen it all across the place. There are many people in this country who have white supremacist outlooks. The Ku Klux Klan hasn't gone away. All right. Those various outlooks. And if we don't confront that, you're gonna see a lot more civil unrest. We need to get to greater justice and greater equality across the board in our country. And certainly within the military, there is work to be done.
Let me start pulling in some of the audience questions. So Jim Miller, former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, among many other things, asks, it says a recent number of war games suggest that U.S. and allies are currently not able to deny a so-called fait accompli quick attack by China on Taiwan, for example, Russia on the Baltics, for example. But there's work by David Ochmanek and others that have suggested relatively modest investments could really boost U.S. and ally ability to deny such an attack. And do you think that this fait accompli problem is an important one that that should be kind of a focus for DoD investment? Yes.
In fact, this is one of the central policies that I should have gotten to earlier than I did. So I appreciate Secretary Miller bringing it to my attention. This is sort of the big shift that we need when we talk about legacy systems versus new technology. That's sort of the buzzwords out there about how you describe this. And we just had a task force that Seth Moulton headed up on the future of defense. And the general conclusion there is, after all those war games, after that experience, we are built to fight non-peer competitors. We are built to overwhelm inferior opponents with our sheer size and might. Modern warfare is shifting dramatically, where sheer size and might are not the issue. And the easiest way I've come up with explaining this is, the key to modern warfare is you got to see them before they see you. And all of our systems are dependent upon that. Because if they see you first, before you even know they're there, you're done. If they can take out your command and control system so that none of your platforms can work, no matter how many you have, you are done. And our problem is we have large, fixed, immovable, which I guess is simply the same word said differently, systems that are easy targets. So we have got to figure out how to build more redundant systems, more movable systems. We have to figure out how to better find our enemies' key systems. And that is I focus on technology. That's why, again, the 500 ship Navy drives me absolutely insane. I would much rather have better command and control, better technology systems, a better ability to use cyber, because that's where we lose in those war games, is that we're not able to stop them. We're not able to find their systems. They're able to find ours more quickly, because we're falling behind on that technological advance. And the final piece of this, well, not the final piece of this, but the final piece that I'm going to talk about, is AI. How can you process all of that information coming at you and figure out what's important and what's not? It's more than the human mind can handle. So that's where AI comes in. It's through all that information and says, okay, the enemy's sending up 1,000 different signals, but 999 of them are bogus. That's the one. Okay. So if you can process that information that way, okay, the enemy's coming at us. What's really a threat? That's the threat. That's what we need to deal with. So really making that investment in new technology, rebuilding a stronger relationship between the most innovative companies and the most technology savvy companies in the US and the DoD, so that we can get that synergy going again, is going to be crucial to meeting that threat. Because, and this is where I will disagree with some of those folks on the right and left that I mentioned earlier about us pulling back from the world. I think the world is a better place. I think our world is a better place if we can sufficiently deter China from attacking Taiwan. Now, if China attacks Taiwan, what do we do then? Well, that's a different, more difficult question. But if we can take actions now that can convince China that it is not in their best interest to launch that attack in the first place, I think that's a pretty important thing to accomplish from a national security perspective.
There's an interesting, very different question from Jennifer Arnold, who's a fellow at Duke University's Counterterrorism and Public Policy program. Her question is, given the recent kidnapping of a U.S. citizen in Niger, is there any discussion about revisiting the non-concessions policy for negotiating with terrorists? I don't know if you've got any thought on that, or if that's a niche thing outside your current bailiwick.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's the Ronald Reagan rule. We don't negotiate with terrorists until we do. Look, I'm never a big fan of sort of blanket, we will never, I don't know. It's a flexible world. I think by and large, the general principle is you don't want to empower terrorists. And if negotiating with them empowers them, then don't do it. If on the other hand, it's in your best interest, then, so I wouldn't make that blanket statement. I think the question gets at the more interesting part of that is, you mentioned earlier, the shifts to great power competition. Look, I still think that violent extremism and transnational terrorist groups are a profound threat. And while there's been a lot of analysis of sort of the downside of the drone wars and everything we've done, we've done a pretty good job of disrupting these groups' ability to commit large-scale terrorist attacks. You go back through the history of those attacks building up to 9/11, and they were accelerating and getting worse and worse. The fact that they didn't continue to accelerate and continue to get worse, not an accident, all right? We did a lot of work all over the world in working with partners. And I think the idea that we come in like a bull in the china shop and just blow everything up, not the right approach. I think Stanley McChrystal understands this incredibly well. And, defeating terrorists is not just a simple matter of killing them all. It's counterterrorism, it's counterinsurgency, it's a broader strategy. But we still need to have that broader strategy to make sure that we can deter those extremist groups. Now, I will submit that those extremist groups aren't just, in the Islamist world. We've got the white supremacist extremist groups here domestically. And what will the rise of that, contribute to global violence? But I think having a counterterrorism strategy writ large is still a crucially important part of our national security strategy. And as such, we will have to deal with terrorists, whether you want to call that negotiating or not. I'll leave that up to Webster, but we're going to have to deal with them.
Great. Bob Hale, former DoD comptroller, has a question for you. Do you think we should eliminate OCO and move at least some of the funds into the base budget? And will the FY21 NDAA be likely to deal with this issue?
Well, the FY21 is not going to, I don't think. FY22, it's a whole different story. Look, I mean, I sort of get the point here. I mean, we all want to be budget purists until it's inconvenient. And from a budget purist standpoint, you shouldn't have an OCO. You shouldn't have a fund that says this. I love the phrase off budget. It's money, you're spending it. It's on budget. Okay. You want to say, well, no, it doesn't count for against the whatever. It still puts us in the same position in terms of our debt and deficit and how that impacts our fiscal strength as a country. So I think having a more honest conversation about the fiscal future would be helpful. OCO can certainly be part of that. The idea, and I will say this also, I mean, I don't even know. Well, that's not true. I think I do know. I think OCO is like 69 billion this year. But by and large, what I know is that the defense budget is $741 billion. We're not having this discussion about, well, the cap is down here and the OCO. No, I mean, we all are kind of acknowledging at this point that it's 741 billion. You want to call some of it OCO? Well, great. It's still money, and it still counts. So I think what we're going to have is not so much an OCO, well, one caveat to that in a second, but we're going to have a big discussion about the debt and the deficit and what it means and how it impacts our overall budgeting. I think one of the big issues that, some progressives will push is the idea that we ought to get rid of the OCO. But I will say, and this is a statement that could get me in trouble, so Monica, cover your ears, that the progressive point here is they want to cut the budget. It's not so much about, well, OCO is unfair and it's wrong, but no, I mean, they want to cut the budget. If we came to them and said, you know what, we're going to make the OCO 200 billion, but we're going to cut the base by, 40%, they'd take that deal without blinking an eye. All right. So for them, it's the overall size of the budget. And they're not necessarily wrong about that, by the way. But you will see an intense OCO discussion that to some degree misses the central point. And the central point is we're spending a hell of a lot more money than we're taking in. And that's a problem that we need to figure out how to better address.
Paolo Messa with Leonardo has a question about Buy America provisions and the European response to this. Do you consider the European Defense Fund as a response to Buy America? And from your point of view, is it realistic to think we could work toward a transatlantic defense industrial base?
I think it is. In fact, it's something that I really I am advocating for and would like to be successful in advocating for. And this gets back to partnerships and alliances. And I've had this discussion a number of times. There's sort of two parts to the industrial base argument. One is just sort of a naked Buy American. We got to build it here. The more we build it here, the more jobs for us, the better off we are. The second issue is, well, we have to do that because, we can't rely, if we're getting all this stuff from China and then all of a sudden we have a conflict with them, we're in trouble because we can't rely on that industrial base. That argument is more an argument for a European defense, European US defense industrial base. We need trusted partners. All right. We need to think about not how can we be completely independent and dependent upon no one. All right. Well, that's not going to happen. That's never going to happen. I'm always frustrated by that argument. People who get upset about a trade agreement because we're giving up our sovereignty. Well, of course we're giving up our sovereignty. If we don't want to give up our sovereignty, then stop negotiating. Okay, do whatever the hell you want to do whenever you want to do it. That's what a deal is. Basically, it's mutually beneficial. And the world doesn't work that one man out on an island somewhere taking care of himself with no help from anybody. Not the way it works. It's a trade-off. And when it comes to industrial base, the global supply chain, I think, is much maligned because it works incredibly well. I mean, think about it. As soon as we get done with this call, if there's something you need, you can click a couple buttons and 24 hours later, it's on your doorstep. All right. You think that happens by accident? That is an incredible global supply chain and of enormous benefit to us on a whole series of levels. Okay. Now, if that global supply chain becomes dependent upon someone like China, who decides they want to inflict pain upon us, well, that's a problem. So you want to negotiate the deal with people that you have higher confidence and trust in. All right. And that's why it is incredibly important that we build a supply chain of trusted partners. Also, it's important, by the way, to build more trusted partners, develop more friends, because you got more friends, you got more assets on your side. I don't think it's a realistic plan to say that we're going to build it all in America, that we're going to be completely independent. Let's find out who we can trust out there in the world and build that relationship. And that's a very complicated argument. And I've already gone on longer than I want, but I think it's really important that we understand that all trading partners are not created equal, but we're going to need some, quite a few actually.
Okay, Tony Verstandig has a question for you about how you see the role of directed energy weapons in a defense policy review strategy.
Yeah, honest answer there. I know it's important. I don't know exactly how. I don't have a full understanding of how directed energy weapons can help us. I know that they do. Sorry, don't misunderstand that statement. I just need to study it more. I've got a better understanding of AI. I've got a better understanding of hypersonics. Look, I think, and this gets back to sort of that budget conversation about, legacy systems versus the future. In anything you're trying to do in life, figure out what your goal is. Okay, what am I trying to accomplish? And then use whatever tools are available to accomplish that goal. Well, what we're trying to accomplish, I think, and this is where I think our national defense strategy needs to be rebooted, is to create a more peaceful and prosperous world by being able to deter our adversaries. Okay, what are the tools that give us the power to deter it? I don't think that what we're trying to accomplish is, okay, we're probably going to war with China in the next 50 years. Let's make sure that we can beat them. That's not, to my mind, the goal. My mind is deterring those adversaries so that that war does not happen. What role do directed energy weapons play in that? That's something I'm going to need to be educated on. I know they play a role. I'm just not 100% sure on what it is.
Jennifer Bisegli, who is with Interos, asks about supply chains, DoD supply chains, given both the impacts of COVID and your stated priority to flesh out the next national security threat in the supply chains. Does Congress have an approach to provide DoD with the resources or to prioritize DoD getting its supply chains more resilient compared to where they are today?
Yeah, and I think one of the keys to that, there's the straightforward, okay, the supply chain's in trouble, let's pump more money out into it. And yeah, to some degree that needs to happen. And it has happened, in some of the CARES Act money and some other places. But the bigger question, and the reason that that's, a little bit more controversial, is we need to make sure that we have competition and innovation. And I think the consolidation within the defense industry and the Department of Defense's number of things, but one of the big ones is they tend to be biased towards incumbents, and it's very difficult to do business with DoD. So a lot of smaller innovative companies can't get in because DoD, first of all, is going to stiff arm them like they did with SpaceX for the better part of 20 years and still are doing to some degree. They like their incumbents. And if you come along with an innovative, disruptive new technology, the incumbents are going to fight like bloody hell to silence you. And DoD in far too many instances is going to go, yeah, maybe, but we got this relationship and we kind of know what it is. So let's just keep it. They're not as innovative as they need to be. And then, gosh, the forms you got to fill out, the crap you got to go through. If we really want a robust industrial base, then we want to encourage innovation and entrepreneurs. And part of that also is making sure that if they're doing business with DoD, they can also be active on the commercial side. Because if there's a big enough market over there, they can continue to develop new and innovative technologies. If DoD keep insisting on grabbing all the intellectual property out there, a lot of these companies are going to say, well, I'd like to do business with you, but not just you. And if it's just you, then we're out and we're going to go work with these other people. There is a lot we can do to really more encourage our industrial base by encouraging competition and innovation.
All right, let me ask you one last question, then we'll let you get back to doing the people's work because you've been generous.
This is the people's work.
Yeah, good, great.
Yeah, it's just part of what I have to do.
Exactly. I like that definition of the people's work. So DoD and the pandemic, the House Appropriations Committee has given DoD some heat for spending pandemic relief funds on military material. I believe I read that you said that wasn't a totally fair rap, but of course you can speak to that. So the first question is on that and what's really going on with that dispute that's sort of popped up in the news. And the second is, do you think there's any hope for another recovery package anytime soon?
Yeah. Look, I mean, we passed $1 billion to DOD and told them, here's $1 billion to deal with, increased costs because of COVID, basically to deal with the COVID response. And in that legislation, we specifically identified some areas, testing equipment, PPE, the basic supplies necessary to deal with the disease itself. And then there was a provision that said, and you can also spend this money to help shore up the defense industrial base. They were specifically authorized to do that. Now, of that $1 billion, they spent, I think it's 688 million on defense industrial base. And then you got the story that, they were supposed to buy masks, but instead they bought, guns and missiles. No, that's not what happened. This is flat not what happened. They didn't take the money and spend it where they weren't. It wasn't like when they stole the money to go build the wall. That was sick and wrong. And clearly, they did what Congress authorized them to do. Now, should they have spent over 2/3 of that money on the defense industrial base? I mean, talking to DOD kind of has enough masks. All right, they have enough. They use them. They don't have this huge need that's not being met. So that was a bum rap for that reason. As far as the stimulus bill is concerned, Mitch McConnell is just seriously wrapped around the axle at this point because he recognizes the fact that the conservatives were not. What he did last spring was he abdicated any responsibility and he let Mnuchin and Pelosi negotiate every deal. Everything we did, CARES Act, PPP, the Senate just went along with whatever the president told them. And I think his members got a little bent out of shape about the fact that A, they were being sidelined, and B, they're supposed to be conservatives and they're spending money like, I guess that's probably not a politically correct analogy, so I'll leave it go. They're spending money crazily, let's put it that way. And so we got to stop doing that. We've got to insert ourselves. So at the last minute, Mitch McConnell woke up at the end of September and said, wait a second, we have to be relevant here. So we're not going to do that. Yeah, it was hard enough to get Mnuchin and Pelosi to agree. Now you got to get the Senate involved. But the second side of that is I don't think that Martha McSally and Cory Gardner and all those other folks are having a hell of a lot of fun on the campaign trail right now, explaining to their unemployed constituents who can't pay their rent, who are lining up for hours at a food bank, why it is that they're not giving them any more federal help. But that just played out the way it did. At this point, I think any future stimulus, if Trump wins, I think it is likely we will get something in the next month or two. If he doesn't, I don't see the president being willing to do that. And I think it more likely that it waits until we get the new Congress and the new president in place. And then something happens in February, kind of like it did, back in 2009.
All right. Well, Congressman, you've been extraordinary. So thank you so much for your time and your comments today. We had many more questions I wasn't able to get to just for timing reasons. So apologies to those folks who couldn't ask, but we've had you at CNAS before, and we hope to have you back to talk with us more in the future. Thank you. Thanks for everybody who attended today. And again, Congressman and your staff, thanks for helping to make this happen.
No, well, thank you. I appreciate it. And I do look forward to being able to come see you at your office, when things calm down and we get back to normal. Although at this point, I will expect there to be a fireplace.
Exactly. We'll work on that. We'll work on that. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Great to see you. Appreciate the chance.
Bye. Bye.